Once more, good morning to everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Apologies, let me switch my video on just so that you can see who you are speaking to. Okay, it's not working. My name is Lungelwa Kaywood. We are very excited to have you here. I am with my co-host, Mr. Zonyane. As mentioned in the chat tool, we request that you kindly introduce yourself so that we know who you are, where you're from. So please use the tool to do that. Zolani will be joining me to co-host this session at a later stage, but he might come in here and there whenever there is something that needs his engagement. So welcome to this webinar. We are very excited to have you here as we try and navigate around the complexities of local government infrastructure grant management. We have a specific focus today on integrated asset management for for sustainable public infrastructure. So just as a brief background, South Africa post 1994, we all know about the history of local government in South Africa. But post 1994, local government had this central role as envisaged in the new developmental state. It was a sector that would deliver on the promised better life for all. And so the blueprint for this new reform really was laid in the 1998 white paper on local government of 1998. The envisaged changes to the entire structure of the local government system and the operation and were outlaid in the Constitution of 1996. We expected a local government that would be radical. The whole form, the system of local government as we knew it pre-1994 changed. And so the country imagined a developmental local government, one that would structure and manage its administration, its budgeting, its planning processes in ways that would prioritize service delivery, in ways that would prioritize community needs and promote communities' social and economic development. And this is laid out in Section 150 Constitution, as I've mentioned. But those of you that are in the system, that are in the country and elsewhere, would know that we are now fast approaching an unsustainable situation, I would say, one that is threatening the entire developmental agenda as envisaged by the white paper on local government. We are aware of many of the challenges, so I won't bore you with that. We are aware of the current state of local government, with municipalities being in precarious financial positions, with COGTA having a list that they update, in fact, every now and then of dysfunctional municipalities. And the minister actually gave them 24 months, if I'm not mistaken, to turn things around. When it comes to asset management specifically, I'm not an expert in that field, but my understanding would be when we fail to manage assets, there is a direct link or impact on service delivery functions, which is the core reason why local government exists. And recently in South Africa, we've seen the Johannesburg water issues. And these, in my view, highlight the poor asset management practices. It reminds us, this case of Johannesburg reminds us once more that assets are vital in us achieving this developmental mandate that local government has. And lastly, just on the issues, there's a lot of issues, but I wanted to focus on these three. Perhaps in this conversation, we might revisit the conversation around the local government fiscal framework. There are certain questions about the framework for local government funding that demand answers from all stakeholders. There's several arguments made about the underlying causes of the current situation in the structure of local government, expenditure requirements which cannot be covered by local governments raising revenue raising arrangements. And when we face that situation, like as a country, we then have to question the funding model. of the local government system, because a local government fiscal framework means that a municipality has adequate revenue to deliver on the mandate that is loaded on them. With that, I just wanted to give you a context to be mindful of as we engage. I'm excited to hear the expert opinions. They will be taking us through the evolving landscape of infrastructure grant expenditures, bridging the gap, asset management and grant programs, and lastly, reimagining grant frameworks for long-term infrastructure resilience. The intention is not to be philosophical, but practical, and maybe provide or share insights and share best practices and stimulate a discussion really around some of the challenges that we could be, solutions rather, that we could be exploring. I will introduce the two speakers that will be handling the first session. First up is going to be James. So James is an experienced practitioner in municipal infrastructure finance. He's got over 2 decades of knowledge navigating complexities around municipal finance, policy, and project management. He is employed by SALGA currently as the specialist in municipal infrastructure finance. He has a master's degree in public policy from the Vet School of Governance. He's also a candidate. He's still doing his master's again with the Vets Business School now in energy leadership. With a strong foundation in leadership, James has contributed in several platforms. I think many of you have seen him, and he's always focused on driving innovation and excellence. Over to you, James. Thereafter, I will introduce, pardon me, just for the sake of time, maybe let me introduce Joe as well. And then thereafter, Dr. Chishimba and Mr. Nolte will be introduced by Zolani. Then right after James, we will take a presentation from Joe Paradza, who's currently a director at Infrastructure Asset Management, also contracted to Zutari, where he leads public sector asset management among other roles that he plays. He has over 30 years experience and has delivered various infrastructure projects in various sectors such as water, transport, in Africa as well as Saudi Arabia. Specifically in South Africa, his focus has been on local government assignments. He has an MBA as well as a Master of Science in Engineering, Industrial Engineering, amongst other qualifications. He's a certified asset management assessor as well as a proctor. I apologize, I should have practiced this name. He's an active member of SAMA, the Southern Asset Management Association. He has previously served as a president of SAMA and is currently holding an honorary membership for his contribution in the field. Apologies for that long background. James, can I hand over to you to take us through your presentation? Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Program Director. Good morning to one and all. Just indicate if you can see my slide. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. So yes, indeed, I have 20 minutes. We only found out about that 20 minutes this morning, everyone. So we'll do our best to go through the slides, not only as quickly as possible, but with a bit of depth as well. So my presentation is around the evolving landscape of infrastructure grants. The topic is expenditure, but I thought that it would be a bit narrow. Let's rather focus on the whole framework. The first slide, colleagues, of course, it's around SALGA, its mandate, a representative body of local government. We lobby, advocate, and represent municipalities. We are also an employer body responsible for capability building, support and advice, strategic profiling, and of course, we also are a knowledge hub. So first and foremost, when we talk about infrastructure grants, we'll delve into the legislation and background, and the apex legislation, or rather the law in the country, is the Constitution, and it has its own mandates around ensuring that local government receives adequate resources. And there's also an emphasis on subsidiarity as well, that local government is entrusted with key service delivery functions as well. There's also the white paper on local government, which is currently under review. And Section 2.1 of that particular piece of law indicates that the Municipal Infrastructure Program was established to provide capital grants to assist municipalities in funding bulk and connector infrastructure for low-income households and to extend access to services. There's other supporting legislation, the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Act, which basically determines the rules and the games around the fiscal relations space. There's the Systems Act, which outlines planning and performance in municipalities. And then, of course, we also have the DORA, which sets out the grant frameworks. Some contextual overview would include the fact that the intergovernmental fiscal system is definitely important in that it provides grants which are essential tools to balance the fiscal disparities among South Africa's three spheres of government, national, provincial, and municipal. They address fiscal imbalances, they promote compliance with national standards, they enable service delivery for nationally identified priorities. But then, of course, there's also been a proliferation and overlapping of responsibilities in that there's an increase in the number of grants, and this has led to a complex system where responsibilities often shift between national and subnational entities. Also on the background, when you look at the primary role and the original role of infrastructure grants, they were initially intended to fund for basic services and to particularly focus on backlogs in previously underdeveloped areas in the country. There are two types of grants that I always talked about. There's direct grants managed by municipalities. There's also, of course, indirect grants, which are managed by sector departments on behalf of municipalities. Key principles around infrastructure grants are that funds should follow the functions and that grants should address local development priorities. In terms of the evolution of this particular sector, specific to grants, what we've observed over time is that in the early years, they focused on addressing historical service delivery backlogs, but then over time, we saw a shift in conditional grants, direct grants that could supplement municipal budgets for capital projects. There was also greater focus on sector-specific needs as well. And then, of course, with municipal challenges and some institutional failures, we've seen an emergence of indirect grants, where grants, national government basically implements grants on behalf of municipalities. But now what we are lobbying for and where we are going as a country is that we want to introduce more incentive-based grants, rewarding good governance and performance. Also around how grants have evolved, there has been a lot of proliferation of grants. When you look at the grants review of 2014, there was a consensus amongst national government players that ultimately we need to consolidate our grants for them to be less complex. There's also a shift to indirect grants, the point that I made earlier, but also the fact that there's always a focus on new infrastructure at the expense of asset management and maintenance. Some of the evolving trends and innovations as well include the integrated urban development. There has been efforts underway to better align grants to urban development priorities through programs like the IUDG, supporting better planning and execution at municipal level. Linked to that, incentive-based approaches, a growing focus on using incentives to improve governance and efficiencies, rewarding municipalities and provinces for achieving their key performance milestones. There's also a focus on capacity building with the aim to strengthen technical and institutional capabilities at local level, but more integration is required for an impactful outcome. And of course, the emerging climate challenges. Grants are now incorporating disaster recovery and climate change adaptation aspects, reflecting an evolving recognition of environmental risks in infrastructure planning. Some of the challenges that we've identified over time include allocation misalignment. Grants are not always aligned with sectoral needs, particularly in human settlements, transport and urban development, creating inconsistencies across provinces and municipalities. There's also a dependence on grants. When one looks at the capital structure of municipalities now, there has been a clear shift away from aspects of borrowing for infrastructure and more reliance on grants for infrastructure investments. There's also insufficient design and management. Some grants lack well thought out frameworks, leading to sustainability issues, duplication, and underperformance. There's a reduced real value allocations. Adjusted for inflation, many grants have seen their purchasing power declining, impacting their effectiveness in delivering infrastructure projects. They are ultimately complex as far as oversight and accountability is concerned. Grant management systems are overly complex, resulting in reduced accountability and inefficiencies in planning, monitoring, and reporting. We also see that there's an overlap and redundancy with most grants, and that the onerous ultimately the reporting is quite onerous as well. Continuing with the challenges we've observed, the proliferation of grants has been an issue that we've observed in the sector. Rigid conditions. In fact, our president was presenting at the PICC just yesterday. Our argument is that some of these conditions can also be translated into bottlenecks in terms of how municipalities can decide around infrastructure investments. There's also aspects of underperformance and fiscal dumping. This is the one aspect that we hear always in the media, right around midterm in January, February. There'll always be a redirecting of grants because municipalities are struggling to spend. And then, of course, there's accountability and governance in terms of weak planning and oversight mechanisms. And again, misalignment of funds and functions. Remember that the principle is that always functions must follow functions. Funds must follow functions. But when you look at how indirect grants are being managed, our argument is that ultimately it's not the funds being directed to the right functions and the right entities. In terms of SALGA's IGR and advocacy, and I'm heading towards conclusion, Chair. I hope I'm still on time. Our IGR platforms are basically the Budget Forum. This is a intergovernmental fiscal relations platform. It provides a forum for discussing financial matters relating to local government fiscal framework. We also participate in MINMEX, addressing sectoral coordination. Our executive engages with ministers at that level, but our strongest lobby structure has to be Parliament in terms of our participation in portfolio committees, our participation in post-budget speech debates, and also in post-medium-term budget, medium-term policy statement debates as well. Some of the key milestones in terms of our advocacy, when you look at our work from 2010 to 2015, we were quite staunch in terms of unfunded mandates being directed to municipalities, and also in terms of enhancing our grant frameworks as well. We were partners in the 2014 grants review, and we supported national government subsequent that process as far as the implementation of its outcomes. Around 2016, 2020, I think the outlier year for us was definitely 2020 in terms of the responding to COVID-19 and our advocacy for the repurposing of grants to respond to more operational matters. When the country was struggling with the pandemic, and the Minister of Health had identified water as a key future of mitigating against the virus, our view was that we can definitely repurpose our grants to respond more to maintenance, to respond more to operations and maintenance, and also to respond more to asset management in terms of the water infrastructure that needs to be maintained. We also argued for the introduction of asset management conditions, and this, of course, translated into a strategic goal being introduced into the municipal infrastructure grant framework as far as asset management plans are concerned. Moving forward from 2021 up until now, 2025, we have been participating in the conditional grants review strategy, and we have placed our position as a sector in terms of what we would like to see as reforms in that particular process. Further to the lobbying and intervention, in 2014, there were proposals for grant consolidations in line with the 2014 review. We have been lobbying against indirect grants since 2021. We've also been lobbying against or lobbying for better allocations to the sector. When you look at what gets allocated to municipalities, it's only 9% intergovernmental transfers. But when you look at constitutional responsibilities and functions for government. Municipalities do 45.8% of those tasks. And ultimately, when you juxtapose that against the 9% that gets transferred to municipalities, our view is that that is definitely not enough. We've also had a lot of advocacy in terms of improving expenditure monitoring, recommending that ultimately what we propose as conditions for municipalities must be more flexible and that we must rethink how we track mechanisms of spending. Recommendations for an optimum grant framework. What we are saying is that there needs to be more consolidation of grants, merging overlapping grants to reduce administrative burdens and to ensure more streamlined funding for infrastructure priorities. There has to be improved governance. I think this is clear across the board. Every time you open a newspaper, you hear all the challenges and the issues that municipalities have. Establishing clearer guidelines and accountability frameworks to ensure effective utilization of grant funds, adaptation of fiscal realities, adjusting grant frameworks to account for economic constraints while maintaining focus on critical infrastructure needs, enhanced training and planning, regular training for municipalities and provincial officials involved in grant management to build competencies in planning and reporting, enhanced monitoring and reporting, introduce flexible timelines for project adjustments, alignment with development priorities, ensure grants address climate change, urbanization, and service delivery gaps. Second to that, in terms of our recommendations, improve the grant design and implementation, align grants to the municipal integrated development plans, promote transparency in allocation of direct versus indirect grants, enhancing accountability, clear guidelines, accountability mechanisms for underperformance, building capacity, prioritizing skills, reforming the infrastructure skills development grant. And then finally, in terms of the strategic insights for the future, we are of the view that we need to embrace a systems approach in intergovernmental fiscal relations to ensure grants are integrated into the national planning and IDPs of municipalities, advocate for a rationalized grant structure, shifting smaller grants and capacity building programs towards direct national funding mechanisms to reduce local administrative pressure, explore innovative funding mechanisms such as triple Ps and blended finance to supplement conditional grants for large-scale infrastructure projects. And that would be my last slide, Program Director. I thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I think you had set a timer, and the challenge is now on Mr. Paradza to try and also keep the presentation to no more than 20 minutes so that we can allow for engagement with the participant. Just to let everyone know, in case you are not monitoring, we are delighted. We have 79 participants on the platform. So let's try and allow them some time to engage. Joe, I am trying to talk in giving you time to load your presentation as well. So I'm hoping that you are ready with that. Everyone that is attending, we had decided we will take questions immediately after Joe so that we don't waste time. Are you ready, Joe?
Okay, yes, I'm getting there. All right.
Over to you then. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see my presentation yet.
We can see, thank you.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Dr. Kaywood. Thank you for keeping time and putting pressure on me, James. I shall try and do the same. So James has provided really a very solid background in terms of the infrastructure grant management framework. I am very much in agreement with a lot of what he has said. My task is not necessarily to repeat that which he has said, but to give a somewhat different viewpoint. It all really aligns at the end of the day, but it's a somewhat different viewpoint with the perspective of asset management from a technical perspective. So what I would like to do, let me just see if I can use a pointer. Okay, my laser pointer, thank you. Let me mute that. Okay, so I would like to just give a brief overview of asset management. And it's not meant to be asset management 101, but I do want to recognize that we've got participants who have various levels of awareness of asset management. So I need to give that introduction. I then want to just align that to what are the implications for infrastructure grant management from an infrastructure asset management perspective. I want to focus on one case to illustrate some of the challenges and also some of the positives. And this will be the Municipal Infrastructure Grant, the MEG. I will talk through that a little bit. And then I want to end off with just some opportunities, what we see as some of the solutioning that we need to talk about at a high level. I do not want to be prescriptive about this. So at the very end, I'm just leaving it open for discussion in terms of what we actually then have to do based on what James has presented and also what I would have talked through. So asset management, we are it is now in really, it's an established body of knowledge, if you like. It's an established discipline. It obviously incorporates a number of other engineering-related disciplines and also economic and planning disciplines. But asset management is something that has come to the fore perhaps in the last 20, 30 years. And to the extent that we now have a standard, ISO 55000 standard. I want to just pick on a couple of terms that we will use in the discussion. An asset technically is defined as an item or thing or entity that is potential or actual value to an organization. So let's just keep in mind that that word value is important. Entities such as municipalities will have an asset portfolio. That might be a water asset portfolio, for instance. It might be a combination of portfolios, electricity assets, water assets, etc. And it's really that which you need to focus on in terms of the scope of what you are managing as an entity. And an asset management system is a key term that I will use again in one or two slides that follow. It's a set of interrelated or interacting elements to establish asset management artifacts like your asset management policy, your objectives, etc., and the processes to achieve those objectives. What is actually asset management? Well, it's really a subset of your overall management of an organization, but it is defined as the coordinated activity of an organization to realize value from assets. So the latest version of the standard that has actually been published this year talks to 3 principles of asset management. And these are the principles that I have used to guide the discussion in terms of the implications for designing and managing infrastructure grants. So the first principle relates to value, and this is quite broad, but asset management focuses on the value that assets provide to an organization. And really, to do that, we need to make sure that we are aligning our organizational objectives. In this case, it is our national objectives, the life cycle management of the assets and the asset portfolio, and then that we have the right processes to make decisions, to plan, etc. So if you are doing that well and effectively, you will be able to then realize that value from assets. The second principle relates to, my apologies. The second principle relates to alignment. And in an organization, like a municipality, alignment talks to aligning your financial, technical, operational decisions throughout the organization, whether we're talking vertically or horizontally. So from a vertical point of view, it's really aligning your strategy to what you do on the ground. So it's the organizational purpose, the objectives, the strategies, the plans, the activities. And from a horizontal perspective, it talks about aligning what everybody does in different departments, functions, etc. From a national perspective, I think this is important. We need to think of this principle in terms of aligning our objectives along the three sectors of government, the spheres of government. So it's an important concept that we need to bring in. Leadership talks to having clear leadership, direction, roles, responsibilities, and importantly, providing the resources to be able to manage our assets effectively. And I emphasize resources because in essence, that's what we're really focusing on in terms of this particular discussion. So these are the main principles or concepts that we will talk through. This graphic is courtesy of the Institute of Asset Management in the UK, but it illustrates very clearly and concisely the elements of in scope of asset management. In the center there, we talk about assets, and I'm sure a lot of people have come across this particular representation of the life cycle delivery of assets. So we acquire or we construct an asset. Obviously, that comes from planning. We then operate and maintain the asset, and then we dispose the asset. That's the full life cycle. And quite often we focus on that as our key focus as we manage assets, which is not wrong. But in order for us to do that well, we need to realize that there are other elements in this framework. It is really the life cycle delivery is part of a system. And the other elements relates to the fact that we need to have asset knowledge, asset data, asset information that allows us to then perform the activities within life cycle delivery effectively. We need to have the asset information that allows us to make effective and optimal asset management decisions, and then to do our planning and our strategizing, which then again feeds into acquisition, constructing, operating, and maintaining assets. Importantly, we need to recognize that the system cannot work effectively without organization, without people. So the aspects that relate to capacity building, to competencies, skills from an asset management point of view are very critical in making the system effective. On the other side, we have risk and review. So this talks to the fact that we need to understand the risk in our assets, in our asset portfolio, in our asset management system, so that we can then manage that. There is a concept in asset management that talks to the balancing of risk, performance, and cost. And that's a critical concept that I'll again mention later on. But it's important that we understand risk. It's also important that overall we have a system that talks to improving our performance, continual improvement of our asset management performance. So based on that overview, I want to focus on a key point that I want to make throughout this presentation, which is the fact that we have tended to focus on certain aspects of asset management in terms of what we do, in terms of what we plan for, and this is actually translated to what we fund or what funds are available to support asset management activities. So the one aspect I want to talk about or to highlight is the need for maintenance. This graphic is it's a very simple one really, but it's in engineering terms it's a parabolic curve, and it's really just showing how assets deteriorate over time. Asset deterioration happens. It will happen even in organizations where there is robust maintenance practices. It will still happen. The question is, how quickly does it happen? So if you are in an organization that does not maintain its assets, perhaps you pretty much employ the strategy of only fix it when it fails, or in some cases, not fix it at all for whatever reasons, whether you don't have resources, etc. then you will not be able to achieve the purpose of maintenance, which is to ensure that assets reach their intended design lives and then can perform at the defined performance standard. So in essence, we know that this is going to happen. Assets are going to deteriorate because assets are designed for a specific design life. If you do not do the proper things, then your deterioration is going to be more severe. It's going to be accelerated, and you will not actually be able to attain your design life. So the case for maintenance is already made just from consideration of these perspectives. But the next point that I want to make is relates to really the discussion around existing assets or constructing new assets. In the context of South Africa, and I would like to say that across the African continent, we are trying to balance the need with the resources that we have. And in most cases, we have significant backlogs. We have demand for services that are well beyond the resources that we have. So we do have to do both. We have to look at constructing new assets or renewing assets. Let me just explain what asset renewal is. So by definition, renewal is indicated as expenditure on an existing asset, and that's the important term, existing asset, that returns the service potential of the asset or expected useful life of the asset to that which it originally had. It is funded through the entity's capital budget. So we've talked through, or we've come across arguments that say we cannot do certain things. We want to build new assets because, well, the funding is actually on capital expenditure. This is not necessarily true. If we focus on looking at our existing assets and renewing those assets, we actually might be able to optimize our resources, the available resources, a little bit better. So let me just explain. I'm going to just simplify this if you look at this graphic from a condition indicator that the condition deteriorates over time, as we have established in the previous slide, and it deteriorates from very good condition through to good, to fair, to poor, and very poor. If we assume that in very poor, you can actually now not provide the performance level that is required, and then you have to do something about this, which could mean that in most cases, it actually means if you get to a very poor condition, you have to replace the asset. There is a cost to replacing that asset, which is quite significant. So we then, in asset management terms, consider the current replacement cost, and that is the cost that we take into account. But there is an alternative way of looking at this. From the definition that I've given of renewal, typically when you get to a poor condition, so your performance has been compromised, but it has not got into very poor condition, you have the option of renewing that asset. This is still capital expenditure, and something that we need to really internalize and understand. This is capital expenditure. We can do certain things to restore that asset to a condition that is very close to what we started off with. And that has a cost implication, obviously. And if we start off at that level again, then we go through the cycle in terms of deterioration. And perhaps in some cases, we can go through multiple cycles of being able to renew our assets over time. Now, when you look at this, the cost of renewal is significantly less than the cost of construction. That's the first key point. So you combine your planned maintenance or your effective maintenance with your cost A, it will be significantly less than your construction cost or acquisition cost. So it's an important thing to consider. And in some cases, actually, cost A and cost B will actually still be less than your cost C. So the argument for managing our existing assets more effectively does really exist from an asset management point of view. There's empirical evidence to support this. So this is not just theoretical. We can actually illustrate this. So keeping that in mind, what I've just discussed, what are the implications that we see in terms of infrastructure grant management? At a high level, we need to ensure that grant management incorporates a holistic view of all spheres of government. I talked about the alignment, and we want to be assured that what happens at a national level and then at a subnational level, it all aligns in order for us to then attain that objective that Dr. Kaywood has indicated in terms of the developmental state. So this cannot be done in pockets. It cannot be done, local government cannot do what it does without reference to the overall objectives, and the same with provincial government. So it's an important point that we need to keep in mind, and it aligns well with the asset management philosophies. The second point is asset management has a relatively long-term horizon. We do not plan for assets because of we do not plan for assets in the short term. Because of the nature of infrastructure, we have to have a long-term view of assets. In some cases, asset lives are 50 years or more. So we look at this at assets, we view infrastructure assets from a long-term perspective. And that long-term perspective is critical and should be taken into account in the way that we design our infrastructure grant funding and management. We should also focus on the funding being based on sound asset management practices and principles in planning. And let me illustrate the point that, James has made the point well in terms of the indirect grants. We want all plans that should be funded to be based on proper asset management principles, proper analysis, sound basis. There should be no unfunded mandates, ideally. So who is best placed to do that? So in terms of if the local government mandate, those assets that are managed by local government as the custodian should be planned for by local government based on sound asset management practices. So sometimes this happens, sometimes it doesn't happen so well. I will illustrate a point again, which is positive in terms of what has happened from a asset management planning perspective. The fourth point is funding should address all elements of the asset management framework in a balanced manner, and then support optimized whole life cycle planning or management of assets. I will illustrate the point again. You remember that diagram that I spoke about earlier. So a lot of the focus in terms of what we do has been around acquisition or construction. It's the same thing. To the detriment of everything else that should be part of the whole. So we are not able to actually effectively achieve the objective of asset management if we focus our attention only on the one element. And this happens in terms of activities that we do. This happens in terms of funding. So let me just talk through a quick example, the Municipal Infrastructure Grant. This is the largest conditional grant that we have available in the framework. From a local government point of view, really municipalities are dependent on this. So what have been what are some of the positives around MIC? Well, for one, there are no restrictions on renewal and refurbishment of assets as projects. Remembering that this is capital expenditure. This is not operational expenditure. So we have to some extent put our own restrictions in terms of thinking that from a MIG perspective, we should only be looking at new projects, new construction projects. that is not the case. A recent development within the MIG has been the 5% allocated to develop infrastructure asset management plans. This is actually a very positive development. It then talks to an IDP that is based from an infrastructure perspective on solid planning based on our knowledge of the assets, our understanding of growth, our understanding of backlogs, etc. So this is a very significant addition to the MIG framework. However, what we have seen, and some numbers, my apologies that they're a little bit dated, but more recent numbers actually show the same. There's a significant unspent allocation. And there's been some work around what causes this. Is this a result of poor planning? Is it a result of lack of capacity? It's a combination. But we see that we need to do something about this so that we actually optimize on the spending of what is being allocated. If you think of it in terms of MIG being a 15 billion rand allocation, 8% is more than a billion rand. So it's significant money that we're talking about here that goes back to the fiscus. Most projects are delivered late. Again, we need to understand, and there've been research around this to understand why projects are delivered late. At this point in time, we have very little clarity on how much this 5% has been taken up by municipalities and the reasons why this has not been taken up. So yeah, it's been a positive development, but there hasn't been 100% take up on development of asset management plans. And the one criticism that we would have is that yes, MIG has now gone some way in terms of addressing other elements of the framework of the system, of the asset management system, but no other funding except for the asset management plans. So this is an area of improvement.
Apologies, Joe. I know you've got one slide left, but you are out of time. So can you please take 2 minutes to wrap up? Thank you.
I will do so. Thank you. So what are the opportunities that are presented? As I've spoken about, we need to look at a systems approach. We need to look at the 3 spheres of government align, and particularly when we are looking at transversal grants to make sure that what we are doing is aligned. We need to structure initiatives to reward the execution of projects to implement the other elements of the framework, other than just the construction. This is what I've been talking about. We need to measure and monitor the right things in terms of the performance of grants. So we shouldn't be focusing on the spend only. We should be looking at quality of the projects that have been delivered, the value for money, and the overall outcomes for the communities. We should be avoiding perverse incentives. James has touched on that. We should also be looking at easier ways to process, to fund well-developed plans. If we have good plans, we should find ways of actually incentivizing that, and we should be able to provide, perhaps it's counterintuitive, but we should be maybe consider even rewarding those that are doing well to do better. And we can talk about that in the discussion. We should also ensure that municipalities own their projects. So they develop their plans because they are intimately aware and in tune with their assets. And then it talks to the issue of indirect grants. And then we should recognize the nature of the long-term nature of asset management planning, as I've indicated. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. If ZZ is ready, may I please ask him to take over the facilitation at this point? Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Doc, and also thanks to our presenters who have really set a good basis for the discussion this morning. I will be inviting in Dr. Chishimba from the University of Zambia. He is a lecturer and a researcher of development economics at the University of Zambia. And he holds a PhD, master's, and bachelor's degree in development studies and economics. He has authored a number of peer-reviewed journals and one academic book in the field of development economics. He has worked as part of his experience for the Ministry of Local Government in the Directorate of Planning and Resettlement, and he is also a consultant in public finance and governance. As I welcome you in, Doc, perhaps to indicate that when I heard you in a conversation with Dan of Future Cities Africa, I then said to Dan, this is the type of an African that we need to have in our platforms. And it could not have been better if it's not on this topic. After you, we will have Mr. Nolte, and I'll ask you, Mr. Nolte, perhaps start looking at the questions as well. There was one specific one on capacity development from the anonymous attendee. So that immediately after Doc, as part and parcel of your insights, you can also perhaps touch on that subject. Doc, as you have heard our colleagues who have delivered, I'll say, thought-provoking and thought-intriguing submissions. We invited you from the SADC perspective, as my colleague and co-moderator said earlier on, to say, given these realities in South Africa, what is the approach in Zambia, and given your experience within the very same space, what will then be your insights, inputs, and comments given the two presentations that we received this morning? Over to you, Doc.
Thank you so much, Zolani. It's actually good we're having these conversations. I'm particularly intrigued when we now start to have conversations around asset management. In my previous works and conversations, what we see is an emphasis on the acquisition, construction of new infrastructure, and actually a serious neglect when it comes to managing these assets. I think most municipalities and central government are focused on the construction of new infrastructure, but then little attention is paid to actually make provision for asset management. So it's actually good that you came up with this initiative where we actually now ignite conversations around managing these assets after they are constructed. What we've observed in most of the municipalities in Africa is that once an infrastructure is constructed, once we put up very good structures, we forget about the maintenance aspect. The next budget provisions, the next budget inputs that we're going to have are generally focused on the acquisition and construction of new assets. So it's actually good that we keep pushing with this agenda of motivating local authorities and other stakeholders to actually make provisions for asset management. So then, before I give my insights on their presentation, let me look at insights from Zambia, where I've predominantly worked. So in Zambia, there has been a drive to improve infrastructure, and this drive has been motivated by growth motivations, which has been backed by increased urbanization. So to make sure that we address this legacy infrastructure lag that we've had, there's been this drive to invest and grow the infrastructure grants, particularly to local authorities. But then for Zambia, these grants are primarily administered by the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development. And then the way they are designed is that once the ministry gets this allocation from central government, it then disperses to the local authorities, who are then given the responsibility to execute these infrastructure projects. So what we have right now is a creation of predominantly two major infrastructure grants. One is what we call the Constituency Development Fund, which was established to finance community-driven projects, which are aimed to improve, obviously, the local infrastructure within these jurisdictions. So in Zambia, we have the central government, the provincial administration, then we have the local government, and within these local governments, we have constituencies. So each member of parliament represents one constituency. So what government has done is to come up with what they're calling the Constituency Development Fund, which meets all the definitions that we've had on an infrastructure grant to local authority. And this actually accounts for a larger portion of what we call an infrastructure grant. Right now, it is paced at about $1 million. So already you can tell if a local authority has only one constituency, meaning it only receives about $1 million US for infrastructure projects, because I will tell you, most of our municipalities around do not have a sound and productive revenue base for them to be able to finance the infrastructure projects. So what we see is that local authorities in Zambia essentially depend on central government to provide funding for them to be able to expand, or at minimum maintain the existing infrastructure. But I'll tell you that most of the existing infrastructure is largely neglected. So what we have, the largest allocation that we have from central government to local government is only about $1 million, which comes in form of the Constituency Development Fund. But then I keep thinking to myself, we have other national road projects that are administered by central government. And right now, the biggest project we have is the highway connecting Lusaka to the Copper Belt, which they're calling the Lusaka-Ndola dual carriageway. And this project is actually costing the Treasury about $1.7 million per kilometer. But then we get 1 million and give to a local authority for infrastructure development for a year. What we actually imply is that if all this money was to be channeled towards the development it can only do at max a kilometer within a year, meaning they cannot develop every other aspect of the infrastructure. We have the utilities infrastructure, we have the energy infrastructure, we have the telecommunications infrastructure, meaning if they just have a tarred road, all they need is this allocation, and that every other thing remains stagnant. So you can tell that then the problem of an infrastructure lag will not actually be resolved now, and worse off, this same infrastructure that we've put up now will not be maintained for a foreseeable future, because this allocation only is actually inadequate for you to do a kilometer of a tarred road. So that is why I was actually intrigued when we now start having conversations around managing assets. Always saying is that let us enhance our frameworks and increase funding for infrastructure growth. The same CDF in terms of implementation. So CDF is a short for the Community Development Fund, the Constituency Development Fund. The way it's implemented, we have local authorities in collaboration with the constituency development committees are the ones that identify and implement these projects. So what we have seen in the past is that government has also been so interested and tried to reform the guidelines that govern the administration of this fund in particular. But beyond that, we have what we call the Local Government Equalization Fund. This is not entirely an infrastructure grant, but part of it qualifies as an infrastructure grant because it's meant for capital projects under local authorities. So the Local Government Equalization Fund was designed to address the disparities among the local authorities. So it acts as a supplementary funding to councils with limited revenue generating capacity. But truth be told, what we see with local authorities is that they barely have any productive revenue base. Most of the productive revenue base is under the control of central government. So,
Doc, without really interrupting, if maybe you can just wrap up the input. We'll still have more time for the conversation. I'll allow, just maybe a minute to wrap up. Then Mr. Nolte will come in. Then we will have a broader conversation as we tackle the questions.
Thank you so much, Zolani. You know, when you are talking about these issues of infrastructure, asset management and grants, I have so much to say. But then in terms of challenges that we face, like any other country in SADC, we see the inadequacy of these grants, and mainly those that will come as conditional grants, specifying the construction of new structures, and little is actually left for maintenance of these assets. I think I'll leave it there. Then I will be able to share more insights as we proceed. Thank you, Zolani.
Thanks a lot for that, Doc. And again, those are quite insightful, and I believe our earlier two presenters will draw a lot from your input, especially if we talk of James and the issue of advocacy from the side of SALGA on how best we can think of other ways and means of channeling the funding to our municipalities for infrastructure development. As I've indicated, I will be inviting in Mr. Daniel Nolte. Mr. Nolte possesses professional memberships of the South African Institute of Professional Accountants, which we better know as SAIPA, and also a professional membership of the Chartered Institute of Finance, Audit and Risk Officers, which we know as SICFARO. He's also a member of the Research Advisory Center within SICFARO. In his career, he has prepared budgets and annual financial statements for many municipalities, ranging back from the 80s and 90s, where he was contracted as a CFO to several municipalities and later compiled financial plans for IDPs working with development planners. As he has worked previously for the Auditor General as well, from 1980 to 1985, serving as an internal auditor to various municipalities, managed the statutory audits at various municipalities during the 90s on behalf of an auditing firm. With that deep set passion for asset management as part and parcel of his career, he has developed an Exodus system through his company, which is the Municipal Asset Management Systems, which is MAMS. This was implemented at several municipalities throughout KwaZulu-Natal, in the Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga, including the unbundling processes for the generally recognized accounting practices, which we know GREP, whilst managing a team of professionals. He consulted as an asset manager at various municipalities and was a municipal finance improvement program advisor to KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Treasury on municipal asset management between 2017 and 2021, where he assisted municipalities with the implementation of action plans to improve compliance and capacity. The practice guide for municipal asset management and the essentials of municipal asset management, the former in 2022 and the essentials in 2024 were co-authored by him, and he prepared material for several Center for Municipal Asset Management training courses, another entity that he is part of. That's all based on knowledge and research in this area. The guide was distributed throughout the country, which is a partnership with SALGA. Mr. Nolte, and again, as I've indicated even before I took Doc, that there was also a question that brought out on capacity development, but broadly, in terms of your experience, your knowledge, and even the current work that you do, just share your insights. I'm not going to pose a question because I know you've got quite a lot of insights to share around this subject, but also touching on the previous inputs on this aspect of asset management. Over to you, Mr. Nolte.
Thank you very much, Zolani. I think that introduction, it took most of my time, so I'll try and be very brief. But because I think everybody knows my passion for municipal asset management, and I can carry on for hours if given the opportunity. But I'll try just to focus on a few of the aspects that I've seen relates to, you know, what we presented up till now. Firstly, obviously the mandates that municipalities have is extensive, and it comes from the Constitution. And I think we tend to sort of forget the other things that relate to service delivery. That's one of the items in Section 152. But there is another angle to that as well, the socioeconomic development. And for me, those two actually go hand in hand. What has happened is that we've, over the last 30 years now, tried to catch up with you know, the backlog of infrastructure, of services available, you know, for the majority of the population in the country. And we didn't frame proper plans at that stage for the whole lifespans of the assets. And that is something that we have to redress, I think, as soon as what we can. And it is not that there wasn't guidelines on that. The legislation actually provided for that. You know, the IDP regulations that were published in 2001 already, in terms of the Systems Act, you know, said that we should, you know, include all these, all the relevant items in the IDP, and municipalities should do that on a district basis. You should actually communicate with the district, you know, municipalities as well, but other government departments, other role players, within whatever sector you're planning to do infrastructure. And then obviously the MFMA that was published in 2003 had a specific section in it that is so important if you are planning, because it talks to the decisions taken in the planning process regarding constructing any new infrastructure, any new project. Section 19.2, you have to identify the cost, the original cost of establishing that, that project of the infrastructure, whatever assets you are looking at, but also the cost pertaining to the operating and maintenance for that particular assets for the whole lifespan. You must determine it. This is in the MFMA 2003. You must do that. You must identify the total cost. And in lots of cases, the original construction cost is maybe a fifth of what the total cost is of having an asset for that period of time. And then actually the rider that goes with that, and that is very important, is that you should then at the same time establish how you're going to pay for that operating and maintenance cost for the lifespan of the asset, and how you're going to recover that. Obviously, we've got some equitable share for some of the services, but also how is it going to impact on tariffs? So how will it influence your tariff policy? You have to identify all of that. That is prior to the approval by council of any project. So that is dictated to by law. So if we do that, and if had we done that, we might have been in a better position than what we are now. From CMAM's perspective, we are at this stage, we're establishing a national working committee on local government asset management. We've had 2 exploratory meetings already, and we are talking to a lot of role players, stakeholders. I've actually met with some yesterday as well, where we want to just reestablish what we are looking at, what the situation is, because we are like the country, the municipal assets, everything looks a little bit in most municipalities, and I don't have to reiterate what the Auditor General says. I'm talking what we can see wherever we go, where we live, what the communities are, complaining about, it's all over. We need to rehabilitate this, and I think Joe was talking about the renewal. Renew, rehabilitate is a similar thing. As we have to make those decisions. What is still worth to rehabilitate, and then what must be replaced that we cannot do without. Now, to do that, we actually have to make sure that we get our planning correct. And there I'm referring back to the Spatial Planning Land Use Management Act of 2013. That's already more than a decade in place as well. Every municipality must do the spatial planning, and that must inform the IDP. And I think that is perhaps already the first area that we've stumbled upon or stumbled across. We haven't done that. Everybody's done the spatial plans, to tick the box, but those plans were not used to inform the IDP, the capital investment programs within the IDPs, and that is, we're not making sure that what is required, what is needed by communities are actually addressed. And then we are, at CMAM, we all at the moment busy developing a matrix, a tool that can be utilized to prioritize projects. So, because obviously we have too many things chasing too little money, and so we have to make, very scientifically and transparent decisions. That on what are we going to do, what are we prioritizing. So we've created 2 different tools, one for decisions regarding rehabilitation and renewal, and then one for new assets, to create new assets, to be able to measure, are we building a sports field, or are we building a reservoir? Are we rehabilitating a road, or are we doing a rehabilitation on the sanitation ponds or whatever? We have to measure what, if we have a limited amount of money, what are we going, and we have to do it in a scientific way that we can account for to the communities and to all the other government departments. Then a very important aspect, and I think James will also refer to that, is that we are looking at the shared responsibility from all the departments, right from the national departments down to the local municipalities, on some of the services that are being provided. For me, I'm very sensitive about the situation around water and sanitation, because I need water every day. I don't know about all of you, but we can't survive without water. We need clean water, and the situation is dire. We have a bit of a disjointed program on the go. I think the national department is doing excellent work. They've turned over the last few years. They've turned the corner, and they are definitely the plans and the construction that's being done on a major scale. Like the Umkomaas, the new dam that's being built there. I'm very impressed with that, because I've been working in that area for a long time, and that is so suitable to a dam. And yes, there are lots of people there. Within sight of that dam, there are about 70,000 households that don't have access to water. So it's, that's absolutely correct. But we have to look at the other side of it, like we see in Johannesburg and we see in eThekwini. We have purified water being pumped into these these major cities, and where there are quite a lot of consumers, and it's like pouring water into a sieve. It's just the water just flows. Now that's double fold, because we're losing revenue big time. Billions and billions are being wasted like that, but we're wasting a very scarce resource. That is very concerning. So I definitely would say we need to communicate more on that level between the various departments. I was very impressed to see. I actually had a communication today where the presidential infrastructure project is being kicked off. There's a new incentive from the Office of the President where they're starting something new from that side. Hopefully it actually filters through, where it involves all the levels of government, so we can get that cooperation, collaboration going. Before we spend money on, the grants must be able to go to the best possible places, do the most critical work at this stage.
Okay.
I didn't address the capacitation area, because that obviously is for us. Institutional capacity at municipalities definitely needs attention. CMAM is doing its best. We are doing quite a lot of courses. We're doing a course the 5th and 6th of December again, where we're empowering risk managers and internal auditors. We're doing that all the time, but there's just not enough funding for that at this stage. And the municipalities with the least money that actually needs the capacitation the most can't afford to attend the courses. But I'm sure that we will find a way. Thank you.
Okay. No, thanks a lot, Mr. Nolte, for those insights. And again, as you've indicated, your passion has come through. To our audience, we will be getting to your questions now. But one thing that we will do, because I see some of them are a thesis on their own, we're going to just take one extract from those longer questions. And again, where we see a duplicate, because for an example, we've got anonymous attendee or attendees. From that grouping, we'll also be taking the one question. because it could be one person. So we don't want to marginalize the rest and then focus on one. But I'll hand over now to my co-moderator just for her insights, given the 4 inputs. And again, in terms of our panelists, there are specific questions directed specifically to James and Joe. Then immediately after Dr. Kaywood, both of you can come in just addressing those specific questions that are addressed to you. But as that happens, Dr. Chishimba, I would also like you to come in. Specifically, that will be after James and Joe. You've mentioned the Constituency Development Fund, which is, I view it as more an innovative way of funding local government. Just in terms of the process of establishing, I would say, those new funding sources, how does that process unfold? And I know also Joe and James, even Mr. Nolte, in the South African context, so that we can be able to compare and reach our own processes. Dr. Kaywood, over to you, and then we'll allow our panelists to engage with the questions that have come through.
Thank you, ZB. In the interest of time, I would really like to allow our panelists to engage with the questions that we have received on the chat. I see that Mr. Matsie has responded to one of them. So please allow me. I think I've had my fair share of say when we were opening. But if you can please have Joe respond to the question regarding renewal costs. A comment is saying, Joe, with regards to renewal, pardon me, the question now is escaping. With regards to renewal costs, this is, in my experience, comes from OPEX, where I thought I had Joe mention that it can be assigned to CAPEX. Kindly clarify, as OPEX is not always available for asset restoration, even is restoration a long-term sustainable? I hope you are able to make sense of that. And then through you, my co-chair, perhaps if we can have the speakers rather responding as quickly as they can to the questions, because we have under 25 minutes left. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaywood. I'll be quick. So renewal cost from a strictly asset management perspective, we classify that as capital expenditure by definition. So I think it is incumbent then upon municipalities to make sure that they frame their planning and their justification from a capital's perspective. Obviously, asset management has to be aligned with the accounting and financial aspects. So what we need to do is to make sure that we are aligned with the AG on this point. But I do believe that it is very possible to justify upgrading, refurbishment, renewal as CapEx. Thank you. I don't know if you want me to go to the next set of questions.
Let's allow maybe James to come in. There were specific questions. Yes, he has answered one to Roshan, for an example, but also taking it further than that, James, in terms of reflecting even on some of the comments and questions that have come through.
No, thank you so much, Program Director. And indeed, very refreshing that we would have a continental partner presenting in these engagements. And for me, colleagues, participants and panel members, what becomes quite key, especially in terms of the doc's presentation, is how much us as South Africans do not appreciate our own intergovernmental settings and arrangements. For example, the fact that he makes the point that, and he kept making that point, that their municipalities don't have sufficient or productive revenue streams for them to generate revenue to invest in infrastructure. I would take it further by saying I am sure that the Zambian local government institutions don't even have borrowing capabilities. So that becomes quite key to note. He also made mention of the equitable share aspects. I think some of the grants that he was referring to, he's referring to equitable shares in their country. And it's always interesting to note that South Africa is such a good base study, or rather case study, for intergovernmental arrangements, so much so that a country like Kenya adopted our equitable share model as is. And when they look back after 10 years and they reviewed the performance of their equitable share structure, they were amazed at what it has been able to achieve. The argument was that it helped with ensuring that irrespective of who is in government, irrespective of who is coming from what constituency or from which tribe, the funds were allocated equitably across the country. And I was amazed by that, because one of the things that we don't appreciate about this country is that irrespective of who is in government, the transparency, and I responded to this in one of the questions that were posed, the transparency of the fiscal framework in this country, the transparency of the DORA, it's such that whether you are somewhere in the semi-arid desert area of the Northern Cape with a very low population, and you don't really have any idea what is happening in Victoria, or whether you are in the Western Cape, or you are in KZN, or whether you are in the Free State, you have a clear understanding of what is coming to you. So municipalities across the country, it doesn't matter what happens. And one of the arguments is that funds are guaranteed irrespective of performance. So hence we want to argue that we need to advocate for more incentive-based approaches as far as conditions are concerned. So indeed, I think that's a clear example of how we perform as a country. Another example being one of the colleagues from the Dula Ama Institute in the University of Western Cape. He actually wrote a book on the Zimbabwean local government arrangements. And he made the point that there was a pronouncement made in Parliament that municipalities in Zimbabwe would be receiving an equitable share. And the municipalities are still waiting for that equitable share. Again, compared to South Africa, where we know that there's never been a point in this country where there would be a gazette of the DORA, and then 2 years down the line, we say, no, these funds are not coming through. So our position is that the funds, as much as, yes, they are being transferred to municipalities, they are being transferred to provinces, but we need to find a way of saying, how are we more efficient with the funds? How are we more responsible with the funds? But also, how are we not throttling municipalities to be more creative with what they do with the funds? I like the IUDG a lot, and I saw that one of my colleagues who used to be in Polokwane is also in the room in this call, in that it has actually been a good case study of performance-based incentive grants, in that you first look at the municipal performance, what is its outcome, what is its collection rate, what is its capital expenditure as well. And then you then decide that, okay, we won't put you in the MIC conditions framework, we'll put you in the IUDG framework, which is a lot more flexible in terms of what you can do with your funds. So I believe that ultimately it's quite important that we find a way of saying, we accept that, yes, there are municipalities that are outright struggling in this country. I mean, even working for SALGA, I can't come to a platform like this and act naive about the situation in the country. There are municipalities that are institutionally incapable. They have collapsed. Coalitions, whether it's through coalitions or whether it's council failures, whether it's administrative failures, but also colleagues, there's the communities in these municipalities. We always forget that ultimately, when you talk about a municipality in this country, you talk about council, you talk about administration, you talk about communities. And the reason why communities, the reason why we have this construction mafia scourge, or rather there's this mafia approach to extorting government institutions for 30% extortions for government institutions, is because that vacuum that communities are supposed to fill has not been filled. So everyone in the room today is responsible for making sure that our municipalities are performing well. So that becomes quite critical, and that becomes quite important. And I think, Chair, I will stop for now, and we can really just have a conversation. I appreciate the presentations that have been made so far. Thank you.
Nolte, thanks a lot for those inputs, James. And as I will be taking Doc, as I've indicated, Doc, in terms of just the processes when it comes to the new, I'll say, funding coming from the national fiscus, which is decentralized on how does Zambia go about that. But before I allow you in, there was an earlier question in the comments from Brenda. I think the first part of it, Brenda, or on the strategies that are being considered in aligning the grant timelines, it starts from the planning, because if our plans are in such a manner that they also, I'll say, follow a project management life cycle, in terms of at what point are you at a specific phase of that particular project. What I've observed in terms of generally within our system is that some of the allocations are not necessarily linked to the project life cycle itself, where you might be having a 3-year project. In year 1, you don't expect that much of the expenditure, but that 3-year budget can easily be just divided by 3, and then it gets transferred to a municipality. And what often happens is that as the municipalities submit their plans, again, in terms of the cash flow, that capacity that is non-existent or limited at municipal level, it also contributes to that. And the last part of your comment is also correct, and I think even the panelists have touched on that to say, when we plan for projects, somehow we don't plan for recurrent expenditure like your repairs and maintenance in terms of the projects themselves. And again, in terms of the unfunded mandates that you are referring to, that would be a case, for an example, where Department of Water and Sanitation, as Mr. Nolte indicated about a dam that is being built. Yes, it's well and good to build that dam for the benefit of the community. When it's handed over to the municipality without making a provision by the department for repairs and maintenance subsequent for the handing over, that then creates the problem for the municipality because it then means within its budget, there must be a provision for repairs and maintenance after that project has been handed over. At this point, I will then give you an opportunity, Doc, as I've indicated, just to reflect on the processes that you follow. And I think thereafter, I'll hand back to my co-host, probably also taking some of the few questions that she will then lay to the panel as also part and parcel of closing the session. Over to you, Doc.
Chair, you'll have to specify which doctor. Would that be Dr. Chishimba? Chishimba.
That's Dr. Chishimba, yes. I forgot we've got 2 docs today. That's Dr. Chishimba. That's just specifically on the constituency development fund that you referred to, because as I was making the notes, that's one of the innovative ways that we can address the funding gap in our local government.
Thank you so much. Please be including names. Okay, so in terms of processes, Zolani, the 2 infrastructure grants that I've referred to, which is the Constituency Development Fund and the Local Government Equalization Fund. In terms of processes, I think processes are similar. Each year, each fiscal year, the government of Zambia actually allocates specific amounts for each local authority. In case of Constituency Development Fund, they allocate to each constituency. So in the recent years, we've seen a significant increase in these allocations, obviously in the hope that we will be able to address the infrastructure lags in these local authorities. But like I earlier stated, what is still evident is that the allocations are still way below the requirements, infrastructure expenditure requirements within these local authorities. And like James stated in his presentation, there is this emphasis of funds following functions. I think there's been a serious mismatch when it comes to finding a balance on the amount of functions that we've allocated to these local authorities and the amount of resources and the tax responsibilities that we've actually given them. But then in terms of disbursement, so it's the Ministry of Finance that disperses these funds directly to the respective local authorities. So there is no agency or institution that's between the Treasury and the local authority. So these monies are dispersed directly from the Treasury to respective local authorities. In terms of identification of projects and proposals, so these go as unconditional infrastructure grants. So it is the community members through the ward development committees that identify potential projects. These projects, in the community's opinion, are the ones that will address their infrastructure needs. So they usually range from construction of schools, hospitals, doing some minor road projects. So the committees receive proposals from the community, so which are then escalated to the committee. From the committee, then it goes to the full council. Once the full council has appraised, in the previous act, they did not have the approving authority. They still actually don't have the approving authority. They have to escalate it to the provincial administration, where we have the provincial minister to actually do the approvals. Initially, these projects were subjected to a final approval by the minister in charge of local government. In terms of evaluation, they have a multi-sectoral evaluation team comprising the local stakeholders and the key experts and the professionals from every other ministry. So if they're talking about a project in health, in education, they will have to get stakeholders from Ministry of Health, a local representative, civil engineers, and any other expert that may be key in the execution of these projects. So once the projects are approved, funds are released. Remember, these funds are sitting in the local authorities' accounts. So funds are released for implementation. So local authorities actually do pay directly the local contractors and any other costs that may be associated with implementation of these infrastructure projects. But I will insist, these funds that we are still giving local authorities are actually so inadequate. But even if I am emphasizing on the inadequacy of the finances, I'm also cognizant of the capacity limitations of these local authorities. That is why I was saying we're actually having a good conversation that blends an advocacy for enhancing the framework, which framework is comprehensive because it's covering aspects of finance, it's covering aspects of asset management, which integrates the maintenance aspect as well. So in terms of processes, I think that is the process that we follow for the two grants. It's more or less the same. Thank you so much, Zolani.
No, thanks a lot, Doc, for that. And as I hand over to my core program director, which is Dr. Kaywood, or co-moderator, there's one aspect, James, that I will also perhaps, as part of the next contribution, if we are not heading towards the closure, is within the context of South Africa, for an example, we've got grants specifically for the metro municipalities. It could be your integrated urban development grant as one of them. My observation, and probably as you come in at some point, is the level of underspending of these grants, ending up some of them getting back to the national fiscus. As part of advocacy, it's more a proposal as well to say, also trying to repurpose those grants, especially in a case where the grant has been turned back. Instead of being reallocated amongst the metros, they need to be redirected maybe to the local municipalities in trying to service the infrastructure needs. Because with the municipal infrastructure grant alone, there are municipalities that, for an example, by December, they would have depleted the allocation due to the good performance. But again, currently, it's more the redirection of the MIG from the underspenders to those who are spending the most. But that will be just on your thoughts, James, on that one. And as I hand over to Dr. Kaywood, Mr. Nolte, as well as perhaps you get another opportunity in terms of the capacity development that you've also mentioned in terms of asset management, but focusing on other functions like your internal audit, your risk management, and perhaps that's a good initiative to broaden that scope to focus even on more functions within the municipalities, because in a true sense of things, if you talk of internal audit, for an example, and risk managers, in the asset management planning phase, they've got a key role to play. But even subsequent to that, specific with internal audit, in terms of the assurance services. Perhaps your thoughts in extending such type of capacity development beyond those specific functions. Dr. Kaywood, let me hand it back to you. You'll then guide us on how we move from this point. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ZB. Before we close, there are some questions. I think there was another question that Joe didn't respond to. So please prepare to respond to that. I am just going to try and add on the answer that Zolani, you gave to Brenda, just to supplement it. You know, it's quite difficult for me to understand or accept rather that we are still discussing unfunded or underfunded mandates as an issue in local government in 2024. I'm aware, Brenda, that SALGA for a long time has been active and engaging and advocating, lobbying for the review of the local government fiscal framework, as James touched on earlier. This was indeed aimed at, addressing the misalignments that you are questioning of funds, functions, particularly concerning the indirect grants. So it's important that municipalities assert their rights and, capabilities in this conversation. They are well represented by SALGA as organized local government, but it is essential that municipalities just plainly refuse some some of these unfunded mandates, obviously in instances where it is not threatening any lives. This will ensure that perhaps any restructuring that SALGA is advocating for through Treasury and through the IGR system, the restructuring avoids the pitfalls of these unfunded mandates that we're still talking about, while enhancing the financial autonomy and service delivery capacity of the municipalities. Perhaps the discussion of the local government fiscal framework, James, I'm going to go to you as the advocate for local government, is one that requires a separate platform altogether from this conversation, because many of the problems in local government, while people want to focus on the organizational challenges within municipalities, there has not been much focus on those problems that municipalities are not responsible for, that they didn't create, specifically the assumptions of the white paper on local government is the funding that influenced the funding model for local government. I just wanted to supplement that question, ZZ. Also trying to wait for Joe to maybe try and gather his thoughts on the other question that was posed. And before Joe responds, this question from anonymous attendee, if any of the speakers can please respond to quickly before we close, is addressed to any of the speakers. Anonymous attendee is asking whether, well, he starts off, or she starts off by saying, although this relates to day-to-day management of asset security relating to protection of immovable assets, this, given the current legislative context, unlawful occupation can be exceptionally costly and not always planned for. Are there any other ways besides OPEX aligned to security appointments? Oh, this is complex. Has anyone on this forum found other ways within the Municipal Finance Management Act to manage security risks to immovable assets? If any of the speakers can respond to that, in particular, maybe Danny or Joe. Thank you. Then I will take over after Joe responds to the other question. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kaywood. I note that we don't have a lot of time, so I will respond perhaps at an overall level. So one of the things that I wanted to just quickly touch on is Dr. Chishimba's presentation. And I think what it highlights for me is the gap between the needs and the resources that are available to satisfy those needs. We know that in South Africa that gap is significant. What perhaps we don't realize that if you superimpose the levels of service that we're talking about in South Africa in other African countries, and then you look at the resources that they have, financial or otherwise, to satisfy those needs, you will find that the gap is even more in countries outside of South Africa. So the challenge is even bigger. But how do we navigate that space in terms of what do we actually do with the limited resources? So asset management offers us a solution that talks to, and I mentioned this earlier, the balancing of risk, performance, and cost. So what you have to do is to understand the risks that you have in terms of your provision of services to your communities. You understand the levels of service or the performance that you want, and you understand the cost of it. And you look at your resources and you say, I need to have a balance that perhaps is optimal for all stakeholders. So if I don't have the money, what is it that I can do at an acceptable level of risk to be able to perform at a certain defined level of service? So asset management offers us a scientific way of navigating that particular environment. Just to answer the one that was specifically directed at me, is the talk of overall of assets, given the challenge now for water as an example. To what extent is there willingness for new wastewater treatment plants, better pipes and dolomitic areas, and technology to read water leaks, etc. So again, you have to look at this from an asset management point of view. You have to do your assessments in terms of as I've said, risk, performance, and cost, and understand what are the actions that are necessary. What is the actual life cycle strategy that you need? And if it points to, asset management technically gives you guidance. If it points to that OPEX in terms of your normal repairs and maintenance is going to be adequate, then you apply that. Obviously, you have to find the resources for that. If it applies to replacement of assets, renewal, refurbishment, upgrading, etc., or building new assets, you just have to find that balance. But you are guided by asset management principles to do that. So I'm not saying you do one at the expense of the other. I'm saying that you need to achieve the right balance. And then lastly, on that issue of security, look, there are some solutions that point to acquiring assets, whether they are digital or not, that assist you to maintain your assets. And therefore, you could possibly look at that and say, I can get funding based on the acquisition of those assets. But it is perhaps a somewhat complex question to answer without some detail and looking at all of the possible options. But yes, there are some CapEx options that you can look at in terms of managing your security. Thank you.
I only have 5 minutes left. I don't know if there's someone that wants to take a bite at any other question that we might have missed, Danny. Thanks.
Thank you. You're not audible anymore, but I'll be brief. I'll be very quick. Just there was a question regarding the safeguarding of immovable properties. No, there's nothing in the MFMA to guide that, but there is in the MFMA clear instructions regarding who's responsible for the safety, the control, the management, and the maintenance of all assets. Section 63 is the accounting officer. Section 78 is all the other senior managers are responsible for the assets within the departments. So if there's a manager for the estates department, that would be the first person responsible for ensuring that properties are not appropriated by other people. Just on this expenditure of grants and the control over that, I think that's very important that everything is spent. So if it's approved, the project's approved, it's in the IDP, it's in the budget, it's in the budget implementation plan, and it's in the procurement plan, then that must be controlled because then it's recorded, and then it must be controlled continuously. You can use your internal auditors to even investigate that, and then obviously report to the oversight committees, because what we want to see is that the mayor every 3 months report to the community. So that is the line of how we want to make sure that everything happens, and that is all prescribed in the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nolte. Just as a parting shot then from my end, Dr. Chishimba mentions that finances are an issue as well in his country, as well as capacity. I always thought this is a problem that is uniquely unique to South African municipalities. So I am glad to hear that we are not alone. Perhaps it's time that we looked towards each other to try and find solutions. There can never be enough money. I think the national fiscus is shrinking. It has been for a number of years, but specifically for local government. Local government is a critical sphere. We cannot see it failing. I think when we look at the South African local government financing issue, it is time that we did something differently. And as I've said earlier, perhaps this is not the conversation to engage with the local government fiscal framework, but we need to do something differently. We need to go back to the drawing back, to the basic design of local government. we are in a different and a much more privileged position than those that were crafting the 1998 white paper on local government. We've had over 20 years of empirical data in respect of pricing or understanding the cost of our services to ensure our household affordability targets are met. Even though there are still some gaps, but we're in a better position than we were since 1998. And so we perhaps need to use the information that we have to develop an empirical basis to clarify really our options in respect of the financial, operating and financial structure of local government, so that we're no longer faced to have these debates about municipalities not putting away enough money for asset management, for this. There are a lot of competing issues in local government, but maybe it is time that we looked at local government differently, because a local government that is failing to meet its objective is a threat to everyone's health, to everyone's life in the country. So we need to re-engage on the funding model for local government. Having said that, I would like to thank everyone first for attending and engaging with our speakers. Thank you to all the participants. I wish to thank all our speakers for availing themselves and spending their time giving us such beautiful, insightful presentations. We could not have done this without you. Thank you so much. We will see you again in the next webinar next year. Thank you.